Hello, and thank you for joining us today. We will begin the webinar in approximately 1 minute. Welcome, and thank you so much for joining us today. We'll get started in just a second with the program, but I wanted to take a moment and let you know a little bit about how the Oklahoma Manufacturing Alliance is growing stronger in 2021. The Oklahoma Manufacturing Alliance is evolving to a better, more efficient approach in support of state industry and individual manufacturers. Our new plan still involves the familiar manufacturing extension agents, MEAs, around the state, but they're now complemented by regional business consultants, RBCs, and manufacturing specialists with detailed experience. One of the ways we want to share this detailed expertise is through these webinars. This is just a brief overview of what can be a much more detailed assistance by the Manufacturing Alliance. Of course, we still rely heavily on our network of sponsors and partners. Many of those partners have capabilities and services that complement our goal of making your business more successful. We certainly cannot do it alone. We have many of our sponsors and educational partners on this call today. Thank you to all of those who are joining us. Also, our team of trusted advisors is now prepared to help evaluate companies holistically by assessing, diagnosing, and optimizing operations. If you'd like more information about this assessment process, which is currently subsidized, so there is no cost to a manufacturer, please give us a call or drop us an email. And remember, MEAs are still accessible, and the traditional services like problem solving, business connections, and engineering work remain available to manufacturers in all 77 counties. We are still there when you need us. And now on to today's webinar. Today's event is the final webinar in a 3-part supply chain management webinar series. If you missed any of the previous webinars in the series, recordings can be found at the OMA website, www.okalliance.com. This webinar will be delivered today, pre-recorded by supply chain expert Jim Fleming. Throughout the event, Oklahoma supply chain expert Dr. Rajesh Krishnamurthy will be live and answering your questions as they arise during the webinar. Rajesh is an engineer and manufacturing specialist with the Oklahoma Manufacturing Alliance and has over 2 decades industry experience. Please utilize the chat function during the presentation to ask questions, and we will also have Q&A with Dr. Krishnamurthy afterwards. And we will begin.
Welcome to Supply Chain Total Cost of Ownership course. In this particular workshop, we're going to build upon some of the concepts that you've learned if you've taken the fundamental of supply chain and or the proficiency in supply chain. Those provided the building blocks to a supply chain from front end to back end. In this particular course, we're going to now help you within your organization understand all of the costs that are associated within that supply chain. Most people don't realize the expanse of variables that go into the costing. And so by the time we're done with this particular seminar, you will have a lot of insight and knowledge into not only what are the drivers, but who are the stakeholders that you need to engage with, and how do you need to influence upstream suppliers and downstream customers. The learning objectives that we're going to cover in this particular 8-hour workshop, or in the subset components. If you are working through a virtual course, you might be breaking this down into a couple hours at a time. But at the end of the workshop, you'll actually be understanding the global scope and opportunities that exist within supply chain and the cost. We'll spend time helping you see how it connects to the bigger picture. How do executives at the C-suite get visibility into the efficiency and effectiveness of a supply chain? We'll look at systems thinking. We'll break total cost of ownership down from a definition, but we'll help you see how do you think about all of the smaller subsystems fitting together in a whole system. We'll look at this from two perspectives. The enterprise level, and this will look at each cost as it comes from your upstream, the suppliers, or even the suppliers' suppliers, all the way through the production facility, including transportation, logistics, warehousing, into the delivery out to your customer or your customer's customer. So that's when we are referring to whole enterprise. It's looking at the front end to back end. Now, there are times that total cost of ownership is referenced at an entity level. And we'll talk through how is that a subset of the particular way we've been thinking about it, and how do we kind of scope this for a particular project. This aligns to acquisition of capital equipment or some other smaller portion of the total system. And what do you need to take into account? So there will be times that business processes only want to have insight to a portion level or an entity level of the total cost of ownership. And we'll help you see where does it make sense to utilize the whole system and where does it make sense to use entity level. We'll talk through all of the variables that go into driving total cost of ownership. And this happens to be a place that, a lot of people kind of just assume the purchase price or acquisition price is the main driver. When you think about this as peeling an onion, the outer shell of an onion, when it's large, are pretty obvious. You kind of know what to expect. But each level has new opportunity. And as you continue to peel the onion back, you see what are the next order of drivers that influence cost. And the further you peel the onion, the more you will expose a level of granularity into total cost of ownership. And what you will have to do is determine at what level do you want to refine the system. There may be places where you refine it at the upper 2 or 3 levels, and that's fine, right? Some organizations, that's where they need to start. You'll have other organizations that want to peel the onion back several levels, and you'll start to discover things that impact the total cost that others might not even take into account. There's going to be regulations that supply chain has to deal with. So there's legal entities that influence an outcome. There are going to be elements of a project and the implementation phase, whether it's on time or whether it's late. What is the impact on the cost? So all kinds of drivers, and it's going to be up to you to kind of work through what are the drivers that you want to model and provide tools and application back into your workforce to, again, determine the level you want, the amount of engagement you need, and how do you set this up so it continues to allow you to expand when needed. We're going to look at how do you start to model all of the different spend data that exist. And this generally is a difficult conversation that some folks have within an organization, because in order to determine what drivers you're working towards, you need to have the insight, visibility, transparency to some level of data. And data isn't always easy to come across. So we'll show you that as you continue to gather data, gain insight, how do we extract it in a way that it makes sense? What are models that we can use to help us delineate what we want to go after, what kind of goals are realistic, and how do we track progress? The next section, we'll talk about creating a baseline map of your current state of business processes and cost structure. So in order to improve, you always have to know, where do I exist today? And my current state helps me define how far am I from my desired or future state, and what kind of strategies do I need to put in place to close the gap? That leads us into, what are some tools and techniques that help us reduce total cost of ownership? And we'll show you the sometimes most obvious type of approaches that organizations take, but we'll also help you step back and see what are emerging capabilities, what are tools that an organization might not have considered that is something that they can easily begin to incorporate into your business processes and conversations with other stakeholders. So there are a variety of different approaches, and we'll touch on some of the more compelling ones. And then one of the last objectives is, it's really easy to come up with a lot of ideas. At times, the implementation is the difficult part. This is where you generally have to interface with people that might have different viewpoints of what needs to be worked on. So we'll be touching into items around identifying stakeholders, influencing stakeholders, determining what kind of cultural attributes we can link to ensure that any change we implement today has a long-term result in making sure that we continue to improve our organization. We're going to talk about impact that supply management and supply chain has at a corporate level. So we too often kind of assume that we are on an isolated island as an organization, and nobody really cares what we do. They see what we do, or believe that we need to even be in existence at times. And as we talked earlier in some of these other sessions, the amount of people on this planet that need impact or have some kind of impact from the supply chain is just about 7.8 billion people. So everybody needs it. The amount of impact that we can have, we're dealing with managing up to 60% of a corporation's revenue in the spends that are sourceable. We're doing it with less than 2% of a headcount allocated across a corporation. So we start to think, well, we're making some inroads. We have a large scope on our back. At times people think it's a large target, but it's really a target of opportunity. And at the end of the day, some things we need to keep in mind. Corporations in the world operate on the fundamental concept that they are there to provide a good and service to some customer base, and from it, they're going to create revenue. From that, they hope to achieve a profit margin. This is an example of some of the larger corporations in the world. It comes from the Fortune 500. This is just a snapshot of what the top 10 companies are dealing with. And we see that, Walmart is the largest corporation in the world from a revenues standpoint, generating $500 billion on an annual basis. But let's look at the profit margin. The profit margin, less than 3%. And when we start looking at that and realize we play a large role in what level of profit is actually going to be attained, you start to see that this number is relatively confined, and we actually have the ability to touch it and influence it more so than probably any other organization. We look at some of the other companies that exist in the world. They're dealing with profit margins less than 2%, and they are of almost equal size. And so, the driving message coming out of this is profits are thin, razor thin. We have the ability to influence the amount of profit, but also there are driving forces in this world. So you take a look at the corporations number 2, 3, and 4. They are companies from China. They're global environment, and they're actually creating a model that has supply chain products and services that are only generating 1.5% profit margin. So again, we have to be dialed in on the amount of impact we have. Well, how do we know that there's eyes on the picture that we're dealing with? There's this thing called the profit and loss statement. And depending what company you're in, generally come out on a every 3-month window. And the items that we show here are what you see on the first portion of your profit and loss statement. You generally look at what are the total amount of sales that is being generated, and that's your revenue. Then you start to subtract cost of sales or cost of goods. That is what you control. Those are things that you influence, you source, you procure, and you manage. So if we're dealing with revenue minus cost and we influence cost, that really has a direct impact on the amount of profit coming out of it. The second portion that we influence here, when we go down into operating expenses, these are things that were kind of the overhead of an organization, how we're aligned with supporting research and development. SG&A happens to be the amount of people we have in our department, the infrastructure we have to support the success of an organization, our ERP systems, any kind of capital that we have to run our department fall into this. So at the end of the day, we have direct visibility at the corporate level. And if it's a publicly traded company, the shareholders are looking at these kind of numbers. So from a transparency standpoint and visibility, we have impact. And one of the last things to keep in mind, this happens to fall into your balance sheet. So on a routine basis, we have these mapped at the same frequency that your P&L comes out, quarterly basis, whatever it is in your company. But you start to see where we have impact on assets and where we have impact on liabilities. So in this, we are dealing with assets, the amount of inventory that we're dealing with and carrying, what kind of accounts receivable money do we have coming in is a function of how well your supply chain works. Into our liabilities, accounts payable, we're paying our suppliers. So again, the rate at which we pay and the rate at which money exchanges for services or goods happens to be directly tracked on things like your balance sheet. So again, high level, direct visibility, things we do to influence the outcome. We're going to go through in this seminar, in this 8-hour seminar, and we're going to kind of break it into the different modules. So in these modules, you'll start to see that we'll gain insight to maybe what the definition is, but we'll expand it into what are the different pieces within the main topic. And we'll talk through several set of slides. We'll have group discussion. we'll break out into smaller subsets to reflect on what we're learning. And in the spirit of action learning, we will find ways to take a concept, in this particular case, the definition of total cost. We'll reflect in our breakout session using a template to say, how does this apply to me at my organization? And you'll work with other students in the course. You'll have a chance to kind of use them as a thinking partner, sounding board, get feedback, get ideas, new opportunities, new solutions. And so you basically can go back soon into the work environment and start making a difference. And in the total cost of ownership, it really kind of drives it back into the amount of cost associated from the time we go from an initial product and service to the end state customer. So we go back into this model that we have talked about in the previous two sessions, and that is the fundamentals of supply chain and proficiency in the supply chain. Think about buying a laptop. From the time I am a customer buying the laptop and thinking through the supply chain, I go all the way back into the base materials. I'm taking iron ore, I'm taking aluminum ore, and I'm extracting the mineral and producing products, frames, circuit boards, different metals that go into the wiring into my PC. I look at oil that's coming out of the ground. I use that to refine, to transform, to use into creating a product, into assembling that goes into things like the plastic shell on the laptop, the rubberized or plastic keyboard buttons, and other components inside, such as the plastic shroud on the cooling fan, if there's one in there. Then we get into the other item at the bottom is sand. From sand is silica. Silica is used to generate computer chips and the glass that's part of a PC. So from the time we take the base material into delivering it as a final product, multiple steps, and you've got a chance to see all these steps that go into it. Now we're going to basically work with assigning what is the cost at each portion of a supply chain and how does it add up and reflect into the profit and margin or the profit and loss sheets, the balance sheets, and our overarching corporate goals, things that you as an organization are signing up to do. We'll make reference to the supply stream. It's a term that is sometimes used by others outside of supply chain, but it really helps kind of, again, show that there is a high degree of complexity and a lot of variation. So we get into just this particular model. We have the upstream suppliers. We coming into the manufacturing, but then between the manufacturing and end state customer, we might have different portions of a supply chain. Sending it to a distributor has to have some cost associated with that. Sending it to a wholesaler, cost associated with that, not only in transportation, but holding costs, sales costs, product marketing, goes into retailers. So at the end of the day, again, the supply stream becomes extremely large and has a number of different elements of cost. We'll look at total cost of ownership as an entire enterprise. And this really gets back into what we just talked about from the time I go to raw materials to the final product. So this is generally one component or one way that total cost of ownership has the conversation inside of an organization. They're thinking about the whole picture. We are needing to determine who are the different stakeholders at different portions, what are the costs that go to it. And at the end of the day, we have the opportunity to make many different decisions around how do we impact that. But One of the things that happens is sometimes we talk about total cost of ownership at an entity level. So what happens when we are thinking about purchasing a piece of capital equipment? And I want to do a justification around bringing it in. Well, in the old days, we just would think about the cost of purchasing. What we have to do, though, is think through all of the other items, the cost of maintenance, the cost of maybe having the service done by the supplier. There are a number of other items that go into the total cost structure of that entity. And we need to figure out how do we capture those and then leverage those in basic reduction or project return on investment or a number of different things inside of a company. At the entity level, there's an expansion around what we just talked about. There's that initial cost, but then there's cost of associated with operation. You have setup time. You have a number of different preparation. Then we go into maintenance. What happens when I have to do routine maintenance and non-routine maintenance? I need to take into account the cost of downtime. So if this equipment is purchased, if I purchase the equipment because it's the cheapest, lowest cost at the initial cost, but the amount of time that it's down, broken, or requiring maintenance exceeds other choices or other selections of equipment, all of that non-production time is falling into the cost. So we have to take that into account. Cost of production. And then what isn't shown on here is you finally have disposal costs. What happens when I either am done with this entity? Do I dispose of it? Do I pay costs, or do I sell it and recoup costs? And we'll talk through the value stream opportunities that can come from this. Within total cost of ownership, similar to the iceberg model, there are going to be many costs that are visible and very open to conversation amongst different departments. And then there's going to be the things that are invisible, the things that are below the surface, things that certain departments might not have insight to, but you, being an oversight group for the supply chain, will have insight to that. You'll see where all of these invisible costs reside. You'll help pull them together and synthesize it into a way that you're making the strongest business decisions possible. We will talk about total cost of ownership as a function of systems thinking, because you're going to see that there are so many variables that go into the total cost. And we have to find ways to piece it together in a way that makes sense. And from a systems thinking standpoint, it is nothing more than kind of helping frame all of that data in information into something we can take action on. In this particular model, which is one of the more foundational models in systems thinking, you look at the top and we have input variables that go into a system. We have expected output that are aligned to different goals that we have. And in order to take the input and establish some output, we have to go through a transformation. So think about this into the laptop we just talked about. My input happens to be variables around what materials am I driving? What is the fluctuation in the business? What kind of global economy is driving that? What are the factors? Do I have a workforce that's capable? The output is I expect to create a product that customers want to buy. The goal would be to create, maybe 100,000 per week. And that's an output. I need to make sure that my input and my output, in order to achieve that, I create the transformational system internally to that. And that's our production. That is our infrastructure that goes into the transportation, logistics, warehouse, all of the different things. And one of the key things that we need to continue to look at is, what's my feedback mechanism? And if I truly understand any aspect of total cost of ownership, and I think about it this way, I can start to think about what's my current state, what's my desired state, and how am I tracking the progress? And the feedback systems provide that insight to how well we're working towards the end solution. So that's the value of us talking in a systems thinking standpoint. You're going to see different components of total cost of ownership. And there are many different models out there. This happens to be one that came from the Commerce Department. And you'll start to see that of the different models, they are all good for the perspective that they're utilized. There's never the perfect model that fits for all. And what you're going to have to do is determine what is the model that works best for you and your organization. So in this particular one, you look at the top, we see that we're thinking about prices of individual piece parts. We're going clockwise, we're thinking about inventory. But by the time we achieve down at the bottom, we're taking into account what are the risk factors and the cost associated with political instability if you're manufacturing in a country that has ongoing issues. What are the security risks? What kind of costs are you putting in place to make sure that you're creating the safest environment for your employees, for your products, and for the entire infrastructure? Need to think about financing cost. And that goes into, at times, I might be renting something, or I might be getting a loan for capital, and that interest is actually going into the cost of ownership. Oversight. Do I have trips that I have to go work with suppliers? And all of that goes into cost. So again, these are just a beginning point around the number of things that can go into it. And then you can go into each and every one of these and probably peel it down into another 3 or 4 levels of detail. And that's some of the things that we'll talk about in this workshop, is help you to understand how complex it can be, but determine what level of granularity do you truly want to go after at a certain point in time. Once you start to understand all these variables, we'll start to help you understand how you put them together in some semblance that makes sense. And you'll start to see that we take the data, the spend data, and we put them into, again, another set of models or infrastructure that help us make decisions, such as product cost, total cost, and what do we look at? How do we break it out from a financial standpoint? Your finance organization or accounting have things aligned to direct cost, indirect cost. These branch off into a number of other areas around what is the individual category? What's the individual commodity? What is the branch that we have to refine it into? If I'm thinking about an indirect spend and the category is travel, how do I look at travel if I'm thinking about the employees traveling from airplane into transportation via rental cars into Uber? And so you're going to be able to break it out. And so what you see is that this diagram takes a lot of data, but it helps you put it into an order that you can start to see where is the money being spent, how is it classified relative to finance standards. And that's one of the things we'll talk about in this, is getting you alignment to some of the terminology that's used in your finance organization. The more aligned we are in that, the easier it is to connect to a final solution. If I come in and say, I have a really good idea, and I'm working with the finance organization to get justification for money to spend, and they say, well, does that go into your direct spend, indirect spend? Is that a variable cost? Is that a fixed cost? Is that a semi-variable? That's what they need to understand. And if I am unable to articulate how that fits, they're not incentivized to really do much about it. So the more I'm able to take my work, connect it into their work, and understand how it all fits into rolling up into the P&L or the balance sheet, and that's a lot where a lot of this comes from, the better off I'm going to be getting implementation strategies. So I need data. I need to be able to put it in some order to make decisions. We'll be looking at, now that I have the data in some order, how do I determine what's the priority? All right, so things as simple as Pareto analysis. We can go through a number of different statistical formatting to keep track of what makes sense to go after. And in a Pareto, we always talk about, you got the 80-20 rule. 80% of spends come from 20% of some amount of categories or classifications. And I need to make sure that I'm putting my energy into the biggest bang for the buck. And that's where data synthesization and analysis can really make a good impact around your finite amount of resources that you have and how you allocate them. An example that sometimes people don't realize is that, those balance sheets talk about inventory, and they'll be tracked at a number of different ways of understanding what a profile is. When you can step back and say, let me look at the total inventory from my suppliers to my finished goods and understand how they're classified. Some of them are going to be raw material inventory. Some of them are going to be finished good inventory. And some of that is going to be work in progress. And that's the way it's going to be tracked on your balance sheet. So one of the things we have to do is not only understand the terminology, but gain insight to what it is. So when I can see a picture like this, I can start to see, where do I have opportunity to reduce cost? And that's the value of creating something similar to an inventory profile. And some of these are modeled from a concept of creating a lean fulfillment stream. And it's a model and book that was put out in the 2010-ish timeframe that really gave good insight into spend analysis, cost analysis for your entire supply chain. And inventory profiling was one of the bigger leverage items that you have, because there's so much waste into how much inventory is being carried. Inventory should be profiled as a function of the demand from your customer and the rate of supply coming in. And it can be optimized, but too often it is gut feel provided. So it feels like I should carry 10 weeks of inventory. Statistically calculating it out, maybe I only need 3 weeks. So if I'm sitting on an extra 7 weeks of inventory, that is money that is going into costing, because holding costs add up, and it really does have an impact to my total cost of ownership. I can think about taking steps to reduce cost. There are different methodologies that we'll talk through. Here's just an example. And oh, by the way, yes, we're going to use math. There are a number of different approaches, very scientific, that are driven from different formulas. And we'll walk through just some basic ones to help you gain insight of how much inventory do I carry and at what rate do I order it. And there's an optimal amount, and it's called the economic order quantity. This is just one of multiple calculations that can go into defining what are your strategies to manage inventory inside of your production system. And you'll start to see that when it is broken down into smaller, understandable chunks, these formulas become easy to achieve. And oh, by the way, they're very defensible when you go in and work with your stakeholders to say, this is what we have to do. This is what the math shows. This is what the science shows. And think about this when we're dealing with from an engineering mindset. That engineering mindset really thinks through logic, data, and application. This does the same thing from a supply chain. So let's help make connections where we show that this isn't just an off-the-cuff feel around what we're doing, that we are doing this scientifically. You're going to start to see things, opportunities around reducing cost. So a term that we have heard in the past, we hear the software as a solution, and that's been around the last 5 to 10 years when we're using a cloud-based software environment to create better products and services. That model continues to expand. Here's an example where in manufacturing, there are large corporations today that are going into this equipment as a service. So they're leasing or renting equipment. And when you do the total cost of ownership analysis, they're finding there are savings involved with this. So this one particular model and reference that came out of the Bain and Company, which is one of the largest consulting firms for businesses in the world, they're actually showing that here are some things that corporations can do. Now, it doesn't work for everything, but what's amazing is when you go out there and start searching for these different EAAS sites, you're seeing Caterpillar is doing this. You're seeing that a number of manufacturing companies are starting to do this. There's equipment leasing different 3D printing systems, leasing machining systems, leasing all kinds of different manufacturing equipment that allow us to find ways to drive our costs down. So opportunity continues to grow. Supply chain, there are many different approaches to help drive down total cost. And what you do is go find them, help discover what is the total impact, and then help the organization decide what is the best approach to take. One of the things that we're going to talk about, we go through these sessions and we have all these ideas around what is it that we need to do to drive costs down. And you have a laundry list of things that you need to implement. Well, how do I put it into an order of priority? A couple things, right? We talked about your Pareto analysis early on. Understand where my largest spend is and what's the potential impact. But here's another model that we call the opportunity analysis. And it's a particular formula that we will expose you to that really says, I need to take into account a couple different variables. What is the flexibility that I have in a particular price, source, or specification? And that's measured as a function of, do I have high flexibility, medium flexibility, and low flexibility? The other thing I need to take into account, how much effort is required from subject matter experts to implement this? And everybody's busy. And so what we need to do is see if we're bringing in an idea and a change. If I require a lot of subject matter expertise, it's going to be difficult. So this particular model and assessment allows you to go through and start to determine what is the potential total impact I have in my cost reduction map, and what projects should I go after quickly because they're easy to implement, they require low amount of expertise or effort from subject matters, and there's a high degree of flexibility in order to implement it. So the tools are intended to help you move forward and optimize your time in driving solutions. So that brings us into a summary. Supply chain, and I've talked about this in all 3 series, we have an enormous impact into what's going on in the corporation. You saw in this session, we have impact on profit and loss statements. Everybody is looking at this. We're seeing in the balance sheets, how do we impact that? And so if we think our work is going acknowledged. Realize it is, and you can start to understand it and show where the work I am doing at my level is impacting the entire organization. We showed you some impact around the world's largest companies are dealing with razor thin margins. And the profit margins are influenced as a function of how much revenue minus the cost, and we impact cost, and that leaves the residual, which is your profit. The next item, costs are everywhere, but they're not always obvious. So this workshop will help you kind of look inside of your own organization to determine where are those costs and what can I do about it. We work with driving supply chain management from a science standpoint. It's not just magic. It's not something we just make up. There are approaches and concepts and theories that we apply that can help us create visibility and transparency and get the stakeholders saying, I believe it, I want to go with it. And you get a seat at the table. And then one of the last things we talked about, making sure that as we implement, we're thinking about our stakeholders and the culture and making sure that we're setting up our strategies to be implemented so we see the results not only short term, but we see them long term. And we see that our stakeholders want more of what we deliver and they're asking for it. So with that, I would just like to say, we're going to spend the next few minutes talking about questions and answers, give you a chance to kind of ask a little bit more insight to the workshop. But I would like to say thank you for sitting through this. You have huge opportunity back in your organization to make a big impact. And good luck. I wish each and every one of you the best in your career.
All right. Do we have any questions? All right. Seeing none at this time, I want to say thank you so much for joining us. Again, this webinar is just a brief overview of what can be a much more detailed assistance offered by Oklahoma Manufacturing Alliance. To explore further, give us a call, drop us an email. We're working with all of our partners in the state to take advantage of everyone's capabilities, so we'll make sure to connect you to the right resource at the right time. Together, we'll grow your business and grow Oklahoma. Thank you so much for joining us, and you have a great day.